GMP, per capita income and productivity, not positively or negatively associated with jobs. It's a neutral association there across all the metrics. Doesn't mean it's not important. It's clearly something that drives our economy. It's not necessarily job growth. This is a map. The metros that scored higher in this education and innovation related factor are in darker green. An example of one of them is Durham Chapel Hill. This is an example that I pulled out because we saw a lot of places that scored higher on this factor generally tended to be those metros with strong anchor institutions, hospitals, university systems, and that R&D component that I talked a little bit about earlier. And then in Northeast Ohio, of course, you have Bioenterprise, Nortec, Marine Community College, ABIA in Akron. PRISM is part of the magnet effort. And then the University Circle bus system. I include this here. What we did see through the data was that these places generally had higher levels of non-car commuting patterns. So they had strong and robust transportation systems, especially in their inner cities. Okay, moving on to entrepreneurship and inclusion. Again, I want to emphasize that entrepreneurship here is business starts and self-employment. That means kind of you get your high-tech entrepreneurs here, but you also get your population-serving kind of mom-and-pop shops. And you'll see here that those indicators are associated with every measure of economic growth. So this is also where I said the more diverse metros were, which is interesting. So this is where you had lower levels of segregation and higher levels of foreign-born population. And here's the map. Mostly in the south and southwest. Obviously, each metro is going to have their own story behind this. And so that's why you have to deconstruct each metro. But here's your map. And one example, Austin, Texas. I think their tagline is Keep Austin Weird. So they're the example of entrepreneurship and inclusion here, but they do have kind of this robust, innovative ecosystem. And of course, we invest in Northeast Ohio a lot into entrepreneurship. I know just at the fund, it's been millions of dollars in the last 10 years. And we have moved the needle a little bit, but relatively we still rank in the bottom third compared to all those other metros. So this is a place where we know we are making significant investment, but we either need to scale up or align better or change some things because we could definitely move the needle a little further. Okay, and here's the last one. Remember when I said those metros who grew the most ended up being the poorest and with the highest low-income populations and highest inequality? That's this one right here. So you see that it's positively associated with job growth, but negatively associated with income growth. Here's your map. Example, if you just looked at job growth, we'd say McAllen, Texas did great. In the last 2 decades, they grew 109%. But look over here, they scored the highest in the index of income inequality, crime, poverty, low-income populations. And there's other factors in there. Remember that each factor is made up of various components. So poster child for that one is Las Vegas. A lot of the metros here suffered from the boom and bust economy. We don't want to repeat that model. That's not probably a sustainable model to go after. And then you see at the bottom, there are some metros who were able to balance the job growth without exacerbating income inequality. One of those metros was Denver, Colorado, and we see since the early 2000s, they've really made a lot of efforts to increase the linkage between city and suburban firms, transportation systems, taxes. I mean, they revamped everything because they realized they weren't working well together. I think it was since the 70s that they had really in-county rivalries that stalemated anything from happening. So Denver is that example, and then you come to Northeast Ohio, and there's a lot of efforts, there you are, there's a lot of efforts underway to connect people with jobs. And there's a lot of efforts underway to connect those lower to middle skill folks to jobs that they can have not only for 6 months, but for 5 to 10 years, or 20 years, or 30 years, and create a career pathway. So there are efforts going on in terms of this factor. We ranked relatively in the middle as a region on this factor, but I think more than anything, as we go forward into the economy, or as we go forward into the recovery, it's not going to be 6-month job growth that's going to pull us out of the recession. And here's a quote from Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel economist. We typically talk about rising inequality and the sluggish recovery as separate phenomena, when they are in fact intertwined. Inequality stifles, restrains, and holds back our growth. So I think it's something to be very cognizant of as we come out of this recession, and we look to maintain job growth over the long haul. So you'll remember we've outperformed the national economy before. We're doing it again now, but we don't want to fall back down again. And I think that I tried to sum up pretty quickly those main points, but I encourage you to think of all the ways, I know I have, and we're continuing to do it at the fund, of how land use is really affecting each of these issues. And I think job access is a key one that we know we can put our finger on and change the needle, or move the needle, but it's going to be difficult. So I welcome questions. I know this is a lot to take in 15 minutes, so if you have any clarifying questions, I'll be happy to take them. And Ed, and Grace, and Hunter, and Joe, and all you guys who have heard this 3 times before, I apologize. Yes, Ed.
When you talk about job growth and its correlation to this income disparity, is that related to, for example, a growth of low income, like Walmart type of jobs, or other policy implications from what you're talking about? I mean, what's the reason that you'll have that the disparity between you have job growth but you don't have income equality?
Right. It's the growth of jobs, but not good jobs. So yes, crappy jobs. Now, do crappy jobs only come in the form of Walmarts? It depends on the metro, and that's where I can't, venture to say. But I think that is a phenomenon increasingly that we're seeing. You also see it in the latest statistics coming out of BLS, which say wage, in the recovery, we might be increasing in jobs, but our wages are going down. Another aspect of that is also retirees. So as people retire that had stronger and more stable packages, if you will, the new jobs coming in are not replacing us. And they're not going to anytime soon unless, we really look for those big wins in terms of how to innovate the economy, create new jobs that are scale up the population so we can create sustainable job growth. Yes, in the back.
On the entrepreneurship, you were focused on job starts. You talked about the high-tech ones, which we've invested very highly in as a region, and then we also have a lot of support for the mom and pops shops that are opening up. But I'm just wondering how much of the high-tech, but especially mom and pop and the business starts, are tied directly to population growth that creates opportunities, new places for entrepreneurs to go in on the service side. And did your numbers or your studies in looking at that normalize the population growth to figure out what the entrepreneurial culture is here versus other areas? Because we haven't been growing as we've learned.
Yeah, well, wow. So there's a couple of comments I have on that, and I don't know if I'll answer a question or not, but I have a couple of comments. One is that, yes, we've invested heavily into entrepreneurship over the past 10 years, and we used to rank very low as a region in entrepreneurship. So instead of, at the bottom of the barrel, we're kind of between the middle and the top, which you would say that stinks. But you do see a kind of change in culture of entrepreneurship happening in the region, and I would say that we're going in the right direction, just maybe not fast enough. The first point you made about, does this have to do with increasing population? I will that we saw with higher business starts and self-employment rates. This does seem to be correlated with this idea of the lower income populations finding a way to insert themselves into the economy. It's a survival mechanism, but a positive one. So you saw it positively associated with job growth. So instead of being disconnected and remaining isolated from the job market, they decided to start their own venture, and maybe they employ 2 or 7 or 10 people, but it's a positive relationship and not a negative one. So we do see that as positive growth, not negative. Hunter?
Well, one of our roles is to try to connect the dots between these different studies and analyses. And I see an opportunity that we might want to consider with regard to this work and what you're showing, particularly the whole question of economic inclusion, polarization, isolation, and the work of the assessment of impediments to fair housing choice, which is the first ever regional effort, actually one of the first in the country, but certainly first here, where we look at the patterns of segregation across the region, not in individual entitlement communities or counties. One of the things we see when we map out where people are, where jobs are going, and where they're being incentivized through tax abatements, through small business loans, et cetera, where the transit systems are, is that in fact people are getting more isolated. Jobs are shifting further out. And the flip side of that, and we heard a little bit of this from Bethany Detler, and I've heard it also in Lake County, is employers can't get employees, particularly for production jobs, because the access, particularly from public transit, is difficult, if not impossible. So I guess it's more of a question for further inquiry on this of how do we begin to pull these things together when we see that the jobs are moving away from the transit systems. They're being incentivized away, as well as just a sort of a normal process of moving further out, leaving folks behind. We also see, we just found about 8,000 acres of commercial and industrial land within 1,200 feet of the best transit lines in every metro in the region. How do we begin to put this stuff together so the AI is not over here being an interesting observation about increasing racial and economic segregation, and your work is over here saying, this is really bad for the economy if we're not inclusive, and it's bad for something like Medina County or Lake County because you can't get employees, you got labor force and mobility. How do we begin to put these things together in terms of a conversation that actually leads to a different way of thinking about the relationship between land, jobs, people, and transit and access, so that it actually begins to work?
Yeah, and I think marrying these results of the scenario planning and this research, I think, is going to be really important moving forward. I personally want to say, we're talking to the right people. It's you guys who are going to do that work, right? But I did want to say, as far as just from my perspective as a data geek, one thing that we can do is measure the right stuff. So whereas before we always said job growth is what we want, and that's what we're gonna move toward. To step back and say, oh, wait a second, maybe it's the share of the population that's employed is a better measure, or maybe it's the connectedness of these neighborhoods that have low labor force participation and live in low to moderate income neighborhoods that are isolated right now that aren't even captured in unemployment. Maybe that's the connectedness, or that's the measure that we also want to get to. And I like the analogy of the leaking bucket, right? So no matter how much you put into the bucket, if there's a leak at the bottom, you're never going to get anywhere. It doesn't matter how many millions you put in. So I think these are, at least from my perspective, I know that I want to change what we're measuring as a goal, and then hopefully the strategies come after.
Well, maybe one starting point would be to begin to discuss. We're finishing the AI, and we're talking about that again. It's, I think, a rich data source looking at isolation from a community perspective. And maybe there's a way from a geek point of view, from a research point of view, of saying, well, how does this work influence the factor analysis work, which we've been working on for a good many years now? How do we begin to mine each other's data sources to ask the right question and measure things that we may not have measured, maybe nobody's measured. But for us, we need to measure it because we've got increasing isolation in each one of our legacy cities. And it's one of the functions of no growth, of the phenomenon we have here of not seeing significant growth in jobs or people, but seeing spreading of those opportunities further and further away from each other. Something that's been going on for several decades now. So I'm just going to suggest that one of the things we might want to encourage would be maybe a report back to this body, would be a colloquium or a discussion about what do these two analyses mean to each other. It's a smaller group and it's a focus group, but maybe there's a way of reporting back to the folks you deal with and the folks we're dealing with around the table.
I don't mind hearing your presentation. It's sinking.
Only takes a few times, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I keep picking up on your mentions about land use and the nexus that you've been talking about. I wondered if you have plans, or maybe you did collect probably qualitative information on either the process or how metros that are doing better than we are making their land use decisions, so that we could learn from that aspect as well.
Yes, I think we're just diving into that from a fund perspective, but there's a lot of existing literature also out there. I know Bruce Katz just came out with the Metropolitan Revolution, and they have a chapter on Denver, and I'm reading it, and it's really interesting. There are examples out there of places that have done as well, but each metro is very different and comes with its own set of complexities and complications. So one of the more compelling studies that I did see about this was also out of Berkeley, but a couple of years ago in 2010. They released the State of Metropolitan America, and they compared cities that had similar socioeconomic characteristics. So not just over size, but similar education patterns and similar growth patterns and population declines and industrial base. So they looked at all these indicators, and then they said, okay, who can we compare ourselves to? So I think we're constantly in this state of flux or reflection, whereas before we might have compared ourselves to Pittsburgh or Detroit. There's reasons on both sides of the spectrum that we might not want to do it anymore. So we're reevaluating that now, and I will say that we're working over the next month or two to just do a baseline analysis of where we under or overperform given our characteristics. And we're going to be able to see what metros clustered close to us on jobs, on GNP, and productivity, given all these characteristics. So I would love to share that with you guys or anyone who's interested. That is something that we're doing as a follow-up to this. And that brings us another point. This should have been my big disclaimer before I started the presentation. This is really meant to be a platform to have all these other conversations that are obviously interrelated about education, about innovation, about entrepreneurship, land use, job connectedness, transportation. This kind of shows you the big picture of what's related to these growth measures and begins to point you in the right direction of having a kind of substantive conversation grounded in data. So it stops there, though. It doesn't give you the strategies to go and pursue certain things, so that's when you really do need to begin to look at the models that have worked for other metros. I just wanted to recognize that. I wish this gave us all the answers, but it doesn't. Yeah, Jason.
There were 4 metros from our region in the study of the 115, and in the presentation you kind of talked a lot about the region in general. Were there any things that either surprised you or stood out that maybe were different between our 4 metro areas, or were they similar enough on these measures that you're pretty comfortable generalizing as Northeast? Your comment about Pittsburgh and Detroit made me think about that.
I am comfortable generalizing. I think for too long we've been kind of pitting ourselves against each other. Where do you rank? Where do you rank? And I do think in general we moved similarly on all these characteristics. You'll have a little stronger on education and innovation. You'll have a little stronger performance in Cleveland and Akron than Youngstown and Canton. But you also see in the recovery, Youngstown and Canton are coming up out of the recovery quicker than Akron and Cleveland. So there's interesting nuances, but I think by and large, I think we're looking at a similar picture. I was going to say, though, that we've had community forums in each of these places. And although the presentation has been exactly the same in all 4 places, or more or less the same, we've had different dialogues after those presentations, and all those dialogues and all those conversations looked very different. So in Canton, I can tell you, and I just wrote up the summary this morning, so it's fresh in my mind. In Canton, we really talked about parochialism and how their education initiative might be an example of how municipalities are starting to work together, but that needs to be a model for other aspects of their economy. In Cleveland, skilling up the talent we have or attracting new talent was a big theme. And what do we do with manufacturing? Is it good or is it bad? Or, this kind of black and white of manufacturing, when really it's a very complex sector and it's changing right under our noses. So that was Cleveland. Akron, you guys can weigh in, by the way, for those of you who were there. Akron was a little bit of a conversation about brain drain. I remember, how can we encourage people to move back into the city? A lot about data, what's the right thing to measure. And in Youngstown, it was very much about workforce preparedness. And how do we prepare the next workforce? How do we work with employers and social service agencies to find those efficiencies that don't currently exist in the system? So each conversation was really different, even though the data was very similar. I'm sorry.
When you look at communities or metros that are very successful in terms of entrepreneurial activity, is there some secret to that? Is it an academic institution and some spark that's given to the academic institution? Because a place like Austin is not what you would think is ordinarily where you would have entrepreneurial activity. Is it tied to the academic institutions or venture capitals or location?
Great question. I think by and large what we saw in the data was that we are talking about a lot of more of the population serving metrics. So the places that have high levels of foreign-born populations that start their own businesses and are, tied are positively associated with the jobs in the GDP. But we also saw a secondary correlation to the high tech. So high tech.
Okay.
So we saw the positive correlation with patents, and we saw those in places like Portland and Seattle and Austin. So whereas I think Austin had it from both ends, I think that's why it kind of scored so highly, because it had a lot of the mom and pop shops, but it also had some of the higher tech entrepreneurs maybe coming out of UT. I'm not as familiar with Austin, but I did see the data weighted toward the mom and pop shops, but it was also clear that there was some relationship to the higher tech entrepreneurs. What we're doing now is just looking at Northeast Ohio, and there's a student at George Washington University kind of looking at, he's from Cleveland, and he's looking at how that spread is in each of the Northeast Ohio metros. Because I realize each metro has its own story, and no 115 metros are going to be like this.
So, how do you measure entrepreneurship?
Right. So we data group itself, and then we give it names. So the factor that we call entrepreneurship inclusion was business starts, self-employment rates, share of foreign-born population, and the African American Dissimilarity Index, which is a measure of segregation. And those places that we saw higher business starts had lower segregation, for example. And so those variables grouped together, and you can see their relationship to one another, and we call that entrepreneurship. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and that has to do with the relationship between those factors.
Right.
And I was focused a little bit more just on entrepreneurship factor, and also in that conversation, the ratio of if you measure entrepreneurship by business starts, let's say. The question that occurs to me is, do you measure the proportion of the entrepreneurship that is associated with small business starts or larger investment in entrepreneurship? That ratio, you get at that more nuanced relationship between the scale of entrepreneurship.
And we don't.
Okay.
What you can look at is the relationship between that and things like patents or venture capital. So if you're trying to get at the high tech, then you can see that.
Okay, I think we've got to move on. I really appreciate your coming in, and I think what it's spurring, Joe and I and some others, it's very good to get the makeup exam from time to time. Eventually, we'll catch on to this stuff. But I think what I see is an opportunity to continue a discussion, either in this group or in a smaller setting, around what all this stuff means to how we frame up investment decisions, recommendations about policy on land use and transportation, and how and several of our organizations do regional comprehensive economic development strategies for multi-county areas. For those of you who are not familiar, that's an EDA program, and Joe Hadley and the NEFCO group does it for the 4 counties that you've got jurisdiction, and Eastgate does it for the 3 counties of eastern tier of the state. Those I would hope that as time goes on, this sort of basic economic analysis will be of value as we craft economic development strategies, but also as we look at long-range transportation investments, and have some discussions, particularly with municipalities about and people doing economic development, about where the jobs are, where the people are, where the transit is, where the opportunities are. Begin to on a daily basis integrate these different threads. So this is a fundamental starting point. And I'm to turn it back over to Jeff, because we're going to start with the Sasaki analysis of the open house report.
So Jeff, you're going to go over the alternative scenarios?
Chris, are you there?
Or Chris is going to go over it with us?
Hello. Yes, I can hear you. Okay. Can you see my screen all right? Yep. All right. I'm going to get started. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. This is Chris. This is Sasaki. I'm going to talk through the open house results that we got. We've received all of them and compiled them, and have them here in the slide so you can see what everybody said. So, for those that attended or remember the format that was presented, we had a couple different ways for attendees to submit feedback. So there were attendance reporting forms, kind of traditional survey forms fixed on the left, and then we also had a series of dial and slider scale surveys and visual preference surveys of place types depicted on the right. And we had this slide summarizes the attendance. So we had 518 overall. And I'll pause for a minute and you can look at the attendance rates for different locations. so the first couple slides talk about the demographic characteristics of the attendees. So we had 382 people fill out the demographic survey sheet, but some of them did not provide answers on some of the questions, so you can see the response rates for the different categories below. Well, we generally had somewhere in the neighborhood of mid-50, 70% response rate for the demographic questions. And you can see the gender and age composition. And the slide shows the educational attainment and income distribution. So generally speaking, we had a fairly well-educated audience that was coming out to these events. And these are just a couple of the pictures from some of the sessions. Okay, so the next sequence gets the responses we got on the thematic cards and the dials. So this one is showing the transportation investment dial, and the card is depicted kind of a small graphic in the corner, but basically we presented the attendee with this dial that you see the large format on the slide, and there's kind of two extremes to the dial. In this case, one extreme is if you invested all of your transportation resources into auto-oriented infrastructure, and the other extreme is into walk, bike, transit infrastructure. And we asked attendees to draw a line on the dial representing their own priorities or their own views. And we also added, for reference, the 4 different alternative scenarios that we were showing at the open houses. So you can see the 2 dashed lines. The one on the left is for the trend and grow differently scenarios, and then the one closer to the right is for the do things differently and grow differently scenario. So what you see on this slide is the kind of regional aggregate. If you combine all of the responses that we got from everybody, this is what their line would look like. And then that yellow pie slice shows you the average rate, the range of responses from different locations. And I should say that, I'm going to walk through each of these individually and you can see the responses, but generally speaking, what we saw was a pretty close match with the average feedback to the do things differently and grow differently scenarios. That's a common pattern you see in the feedback that we got. And so this is a slightly different way of looking at it. In the center, or the left there, we've broken the dial into 3 different sectors. So the one on the left with the blue text is more toward audience-oriented infrastructure than the trend and growth thing scenario. The one in the middle with the gray is somewhere in between, and then the green on the right is even more heavily invested in walk, bike, and transit infrastructure than the do things differently and grow differently scenarios. So you can see the responses kind of contextualized against where the scenarios fell along the spectrum. And so we're summarizing here just the total number of cards that fell in each of those categories. So vast majority were either somewhere in the middle or even more aggressively investing in the walk, bike, and transit than the do things differently and grow differently scenarios. And then there's just a little bit more detailed information there on the right. Okay, and this graphic or this chart is looking at the same information in a little bit different way. There's a lot going on here, so I'll walk through it. Each of the bars that you see, the box and whisker plots, represent the feedback that we got from different locations. So you can see the location labeled along the x-axis along the bottom. And then the range of responses that are possible along the dial are represented on the vertical axis. And so the higher you go along this chart, the closer you get towards 100% investment in walk, bike, and transit. And then the bottom numbers represent the investment in auto-oriented infrastructure. So you can see the dashed orange line are the different scenario sets. And the blue line is the regional median, so very close to the two different lead scenarios. And for the box plots themselves, the yellow rectangle represents kind of the middle 50% of the responses, and then the lines represent the extremes. So in every single location, we had at least one person that submitted a response that was all the way over to the right, so 100% walk, bike, transit infrastructure. And then in a couple of locations, we had at least one response that was all the way over to the other side of the dial, but in several of the locations, we didn't have any responses that were closer to auto-oriented than the scenario. So for example, a 6 was the lowest we got in Cleveland, and it's a Cleveland Zoo and the library. And we also, on the dial cards, we offered an opportunity to leave free-form comments. And not everybody did so, but we had a fair amount of comments from those. And so here, this is just a list of some of the kind of what we thought were some of the representative comments that we got with the score that person gave in parentheses. So I'll just pause for a minute and read these. Okay, so the next couple slides are looking at the next dial that we asked people to fill out, which was the outward growth versus inward reinvestment. So the left extreme is complete kind of ex-urban build outward approach to land use planning and development, and the right extreme is 100% infill and redevelopment. Same graphical convention, you see where the four alternative scenarios fall along that spectrum. And then on top of that is the regional average in the orange arrow, and then the range of averages from the different locations, and that's the orange highlight. So in this case, the responses indicated an even more aggressive inward reinvestment prioritization than the do things differently and grow differently scenarios embodied. And again, these are the responses separated into the three different kind of categories or zones within the dial, and then some additional details about the response rates that we got. This is the box and whisker plot for the same dial. And similar to transit, we had numerous locations where the lowest score was right in the middle. That was a little bit surprising to us. And this is a sample of some of the comments we got. And this file was asking about development, environmental regulations relative to development. So complete, lack of restriction or regulation on the left-hand side, and very aggressive environmental regulations on the right-hand side. And this one, like the infill dial, came out actually even more aggressive than the do things differently and grow differently scenario. here's the breakdown by location. Here's some comments. So we also handed out a card that had 3 different dials on it, and this was talking about neighborhood characteristics and place type, and essentially asking the attendee to kind of describe what their ideal neighborhood or community would look like. So there were 3 different questions that we asked on the card, and the first one was about dispersed development on the left-hand side versus compact development on the right. So you can see the overall regional tendency depicted here. And responses by location. The next question was about land use, so and specifically about mixed use development. So the left-hand side is completely segregated uses, and on the right-hand side of the dial is a very intensely mixed use style of development. And so you can see regional average very much towards the mixed use side of the spectrum. And we also asked about mobility and transit, so auto-oriented on the left, and bicycle and pedestrian on the right. And in this case, we were specifically asking about neighborhood design independent of a metropolitan or regional transit system. So specifically, the design of the coaches in the neighborhood that would make it more amenable to walking, or have tunnel parking, for example, and maybe you drive. So this is the regional average that we got. And responses by location. Okay, so this is just a summary of the amount of feedback and the number of cards that we received for the ideal community question. And what we wanted to do here was isolate some of the most frequently recurrent themes, because we also provided space for open-ended comments. And so we group those by theme and then count the number of times that theme emerged. So we're asking, broadly speaking, what does your ideal community look like? This is a list of the top 10 recurrent themes that came up. And then you can also see on the right, so transit is the most frequently recurring theme that we heard. And then you can see for those respondents that had transit as a theme in their comments, you can see what their average scores were to the right. had a survey form that listed each of the 4 alternative scenarios and asked attendees to rate each of them on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of how well it aligned with their vision for the future of Northeast Ohio, 1 being aligned very poorly, 5 being aligned very well. We asked for comments, and then we also asked which elements mattered most in them making their decisions and what was missing from the scenarios. So this is a rundown on the responses we got for each of the scenarios. So these are the responses for the trend scenario. So 209 in the aligned poorly category, 49 in neutral, and 23 in aligned well. And you can see a little bit more detail in terms of the number of responses we got. And these are some of the comments we got for the trend scenario. So basically, we group the responses into 3 different categories. So if the person needed a 1, for example, we would put them in the top category. And then why people feel the scenario poorly. For those that gave it a 1. For those that gave it a 3, we consider that neutral, and we group their comments in the middle. And for those that scored it very highly, we group their responses at the bottom. And this is just a sampling of the comments we heard. Yeah, you can see also with the very bottom comment, I think it's an important case study or kind of something to keep in mind with these types of questions is an important caveat, which is, they're a little bit open-ended, and in this case, the person circled a 5, not because they thought that that's what they wanted or that it aligned with their vision, but that they say this will not happen. This will be what happens if we do not break the cycle of cynicism, apathy, or non-cooperation. So that's, in addition to just seeing the themes in the comments, it's also important to have them on hand so that you can compare the numbers with the comments. So, you can't just interpret them just looking at the numbers. You have to understand that some of the attendees may have had other kind of answering rubrics in mind when they filled it out. Okay, so this is the same for the grow the same scenario. So this is the one with the trend policies, but with a higher level of population and employment growth. So similar to trend, by and large, attendees thought that this aligned poorly with their vision. And these are some of the comments. Responses we got for the grow differently scenario. So this was the alternative policies, but with the same relatively flat level of population employment growth as trend. So total shift, many more respondents thought that this scenario aligned well with their regional vision. The comments. actually, my apologies, it looks like, yeah, so I was showing you the growth differently. This is the high population employment with the different policies. And this is the do things differently. So this is the flat population employment with the different policies. So also back and forth between the two, just by point of comparison. So both of the alternative policies, this is with the low population employment, and that's the high population employment. And these are the responses we got. So, in general, one of the things we noticed is that most of the respondents found at least one scenario that they liked. It was very rare that people ranked all of them poorly. There were only 2 people that gave all of the scenarios either a 1 or a 2, and only 8 people that didn't give any scenario more than a 3. So we thought that was interesting and worth noting. And these are some of the responses we got when we asked people what was missing. Here's some additional comments of things that people thought were missing. And then we did a ranking of the issues that matter most with respondents with the top themes here in bold on the top left. So as you would expect, it's a very wide range of topics, but there were a much smaller manageable set that there was, I think, much more consensus around. Should be noted, though, that this is it's a count of the frequency of a theme in the comment section, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what the attitude is of the respondent to that topic. So, it's basically saying that growth, for example, reinvestment was a hot topic. It was something that people were talking about a lot, but it doesn't tell you, just this summary doesn't tell you what the views were about those topics. And this is a summary of the themes that kind of touch on home rule, personal freedom, market, property rights, etc. So 2.5% of all the comments had issues that touched on those topics. And we also did the place type survey, so from using the categories from quality connected places. We had boards that gave a summary of what each of the place types are. And we have the legacy industrial cities, first-ring suburbs, second-ring suburbs, outer-ring suburbs, established cities and towns, and rural townships. And just walk through what some of their characteristics are, and give some photo examples and a place example. And so we asked 2 different questions for each place type. We said, first, do you use, value, and enjoy this place type? And also, should we as a region invest in this place type? So this gives you the overall summary of all the different place types with the 2 different questions on the top and the bottom. So, and attendees had red and green stickers, and they could stick their kind of the vote on the board itself, on paper. So this gives you a summary of what the votes were. I think one question that's interesting to ask about this data that, is probably the answer varies from person to person depending on who is placing the dot. So when you see cases where the top and the bottom look different, I think it's interesting to ask why that happens. So if you look at the legacy industrial cities, generally the answers are very similar in terms of do you use, value, and joy, and should we invest? But then when you look at second-ring suburbs and outer-ring suburbs, and even rural townships, you see fairly significant difference in the responses. And, that could mean a variety of things. That could mean there's a market mismatch. There's people that are living in outer-ring suburbs that are doing so because of cost or other factors or schools, but maybe they would love to live downtown if they could, if the school was better, or whatever, factors are most important to them. But that was one area that I thought was particularly interesting. And this is just the same data zoomed in, so it's a little bit easier to see. So we're showing the legacy industrial cities, first-ring suburbs, and second-ring suburbs. And these are the outer-ring suburbs, cities and towns, and rural townships. So that's a lot of information, and we had several different feedback mechanisms that I just walked through, and looking at all of this kind of at a high level, what are some of the big takeaways? We felt like looking at the responses, and particularly the comments, that people were really understanding what the issues were. We got a lot of very intelligent comments. It seemed like people got it, they were engaged, and sometimes different opinions, but people were very well engaged, and which maybe is surprising when you look at the education level of the attendees. We also had people were very motivated. For those that filled out the dials, we had 50% providing additional comments beyond just filling out the dials. We had a wide range of perspectives, but definitely very clear tendencies, at least of those that choose to fill out the card. We had the tendency was very much toward the different, do things differently, grow differently strategies, the different policies that are represented in those scenarios. Different people had very different attitudes about growth depending on where they were in the region. And then some of the priorities, reinvestment and reuse was high priority, which is also something that we model very intentionally in the different lead scenarios. Increased opportunities for public transit, but there's a little bit of a balance, desire for balance investment as well. Open space and agricultural land preservation were key issues, and there seemed to be a strong demand for mixed-use, compact, walkable, and bikeable neighborhoods. And all of this is very consistent with what we heard from the surveys and what we heard at the first round workshop, and also the responses that we got from Imagine Idea. Then the question is, how do we use this information moving forward? The next step we're going to start working on is preferred kind of emerging regional vision as an outcome of the scenario modeling process. And this kind of feedback is obviously critical to the architecture of that vision. And from our perspective, the priorities were very much in line with the do things differently, grow differently policies. And so it's kind of a question of taking a deeper dive into what those policies would be, how would they be structured, where would they be located, just getting a little bit more detail, getting into I think one of the comments in the previous slide was how do you get there? So that's kind of exactly what it is. It's talking about how in a little bit more detail rather than reconceptualizing a completely different set of priorities. We find in these regional projects that it really varies from region to region. Sometimes we'll do, we always try to create bracketing scenarios from a policy perspective. And in the sense that, for any of the issues that we have with dials, say for transit, we try to have some scenarios that are much more on the auto end of the spectrum, much more on the transit end of the spectrum, and kind of bracket the scenarios, and then often you get responses that fall somewhere in the middle, and then the preferred vision is kind of somewhere in between. In this case, it was much more directed, much more pointed toward the different scenarios. We thought it was very interesting, so that's going to be a key takeaway from this exercise. It's more like a zoom in rather than a pan around the geographic analogy. So where we are currently with the modeling and the scenarios, we have these fairly detailed 4 different regional land use scenarios. We have all this feedback. So we want to basically pull this apart, dive in deeper, and kind of enrich what the product and what it is, and look at it from a variety of different perspectives. So, one way to look at it is let's start identifying some of the strategic investment areas, so the nodes, the corridors, the desired connections, which has a spatial element. We also want to start talking in much more detail about the pathways to implementation. So the scenarios model outcomes, and we can measure the outcomes, and we can put this to the public and say, here are the scenarios, here are the outcomes. What is your vision? How do these align? How do these scenarios align with your vision? So we have that information now, and we have a pretty clear direction on overall outcomes. So now we need to flesh out the kind of pathways to implementation that we model in the do things differently and grow differently scenario. How do you actually get there? What does that mean? We also have the range of indicator outcomes from the scenario exercise, so we can start to pull that information and re-express it as targets and benchmarking in the future. So, here's there's an emerging regional vision. We have kind of a ballpark sense of what the range of outcomes could be relative to any indicators we could use, and we also know where the priorities fall. So, what should we be striving for as a region? On a 5-year, 10-year basis, or where should we hope to get by 2040 or whatever the time frame may be. And we also, particularly from the place site feedback, we have a lot of rich information for long-term planning, for zoning, any sort of kind of formal planning function that deals with land use and development and housing types. We can bake this information into the emerging regional vision in a very explicit way. And so we have a lot of really helpful and detailed information about what kind of housing or what kind of neighborhoods do people want to see. So that's another thing that will feature very prominently into the preferred vision. One thing in closing, worth mentioning, this is kind of the quick overview version of this. Obviously, this exercise generated tons of data, and I tried to walk through some of the highlights today. But we're hosting a webinar next Thursday September 5th at 2 p.m. And registration details will be emailed by the PMO, but the intention there is to take a deeper dive into the feedback that we received from the open houses for those who are interested. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Chris, are there any questions? Well, we have Chris on the phone. That was a lot to digest. I imagine that those who do want some further follow-up will participate in the webinar. So then moving on to the next item. Jeff, you're going to give us a report on Imagine My Neo.
And the webinar that Chris mentioned is also on the green sheets, from the green sheets. There's a lot of information there. We will be sending out that PowerPoint that went later tonight along with the webinar. We did want to give you an update on some of the outcomes and results from Imagine My Neo. As you know, we launched this online tool through the software that was developed by Sasaki called CrowdGauge back in the beginning of June 12th. And it remained open until the middle of August, for about 2 months. What we presented at the open houses was the first cut of the data that was through July 15th. And so what you'll see today is the total data. There was some changes between the middle of July and late August, but they were very, very minimal in terms of the overall priority levels. Just a quick orientation to it in terms of how it worked for those of you that took the time to go through it. Thank you, but really we wanted to understand people's priorities, so there was a list of 15 priorities, which I'll go over in a minute. And people had up to 35 stars to distribute through those priorities with up to 5 stars per priority. After they were done with that section, they would move on to the next section, which was much more educational about the impacts of some of their priorities, whether it be on land use, whether it be on taxes, air quality, and kind of going back and forth and really be able to engage them in some learning about some of the things that they value and some of the things that they feel are important. The last step was really for them to roll up their sleeves and invest a certain amount of dollars in different projects. And the different projects had different investment amounts, so it could be $1 for so-and-so versus, X amount of dollars for brownfield remediation. On that page also was a list of policies that they were able to give the thumbs up or thumbs down to or not respond to at all. So what you're seeing today is the first pass of this data. We're going to put together a much more formal report for the next month. So the total amount of participants we had was 1,458. Out of those, 93 were from out of the 12-county region. So our total audience of Northeast Ohio participants within our 12 counties was 1,365. It is worthy to note that out of the 93 that participated out of the region, there was 25 that actually were born here but moved away. So they showed some interest in taking part in the survey. Relative to some of the demographics, it was pretty much evenly split, 50% male, 50% female. In terms of geographies, Cuyahoga County was much more oversampled, as you might suspect. But some other parts of the region really did perform pretty well. I think I mentioned at the July board meeting that Ashtabula did a really great job comparatively to their portion of the population in the entire region. There'll be much more detail on this as we roll out the final reports, including diving down into some of the results further by counties and by in terms of age demographics, the biggest demographic range was between 26 and 35, which represented about 25% of the audience, which I think is great because we are really looking to find ways to reach out to younger people in this project. In terms of their relationship in Northeast Ohio, about 65-66% were born and raised here, and 33% moved here from somewhere else. In terms of race, oversampled in the white category. We did do some specific outreach in the last couple of weeks leading up to the close in August, when we really didn't make a dent in terms of some of the outreach to some of the other populations in the region. So here are the 15 priorities, and they range from clean water to the type of character your community has, to open spaces, to experiencing great arts and culture. There was quite a bit of back and forth over, I think, a 6-week period in March and the beginning of April in terms of what these priorities would be. We have clean air, water, and land was by far the priority that was given the most stars and had an average of 3.5 out of the 5 stars. And that was followed closely by finding good jobs and sharing in the region's financial success. Recreational opportunities in parks nearby. Maintaining existing infrastructure was number 4. And experiencing great arts, culture, sports, and entertainment was number 5. The one thing that was interesting as we looked at the results compared to July to the total amount was that infrastructure actually moved up from 6 to 4. And I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of the participation came at the forums, at the open houses. So infrastructure, I think, was more in people's minds as they filled out and walked through the exercise. This is a brief look at the top 5 priorities by county. As you can see, clean air, water, and land was number 1 or number 2 in almost every one of the 12 counties. And then after you got down to 2 and 3, it kind of started to add in some different priorities depending on where people were from. Once again, Ashtabula, I think, had the interesting enough shared the same priorities as the overall list, much more consistently than some of the other counties. Relative to policy and policy approvals, the highest policy that was ranked was locating new jobs, major developments, and services near transit stops, encouraging mixed-use development, and providing some services on a regional or multi-community basis were the top 3. And then the next, kind of in the 700s, were infrastructure, stronger pollution regulations, and encouraging a greater variety of housing types in the community. And again, this is a like or dislike or not participate in that question. So the last column on the right you see is the percentage of likes by the total responses that actually filled in that question. And then lastly, in terms of the projects that people would invest in, cleaning up vacant and abandoned properties, including brownfields, was by far the highest amount of projects that were invested in, followed by creating vibrant public spaces, investing in job training, investing in pedestrian, bicycle, and public transit routes, and then providing incentives for job creation in the top 5. questions? A lot of stuff. So our next steps with the Imagine My Neo information is to dig down and put the entire priority list by each county, policy list by each county, project list by each county, which we'll be able to send out to all of you. And then do a similar analysis by the MPOs and the COGS so that you have that information by the MPOs as well. And then we're also going to look at some of the subcategories under the projects because each of the projects also had a couple of subcategories related to different types of transportation or different types of investment. So we'll also cover this at the webinar next Thursday, kind of in partnership with society as well. Questions? Thank you.
Sarah's going to give us a report now on the progress and status of the products.
Good afternoon, everyone. You've seen this before, the update on the products. We have our action products there, dashboard, policy recommendations, toolkit, and best practices, and pilots with a brief explanation of what each of those are. And then our presentation and webinar schedule. Anything that's italicized has obviously already occurred. We have listed on there the draft policy brief and draft toolkit and best practices webinars. Those are actually happening on September 9th. We couldn't find a date within August that worked well enough. So you have information in your packets on the green sheets. The webinar registration information is on there if you'd like to participate. It is at 10 a.m. on September 9th when Kelly Britt and Anthony Kovac will give updates on where their different products are. And our look ahead calendar, we're starting to wrap things up now. So most of what the program managers are working on right now is just feeding in that final feedback from the open houses and ultimately what becomes a preferred vision in terms of narrowing or streamlining their products to be most reflective of the preferred vision. So it'll be for toolkit the tools that are most representative of what would move us towards that preferred vision. And I think Chris is actually off the line, so let me get rid of this. It's still a different setup than mine. I will leave that on there so I don't mess it up, because that would be far more disastrous. So that actually says on August 20th we had a web conference with the Sasaki team, actually the entire team, everyone was participating in that, where we're going through and giving an update on all of our products and how they can be integrated into all of the work that the rest of the team is doing. I mean, that's been our intention the entire time, but just going through and getting everyone on the same page as to where we are. So in the final documentation, what gets pulled out, which of the pilots are the ones that get highlighted, what of the tools are the ones that get highlighted. We do intend to have everything as standalone products as well. But it was just a way to bring everyone together. And so that was a very productive session. We went through and just gave a full update. Thank you. All right. So moving along for our dashboard, that's Joe McDonald's area. He's been working through, we have the draft of the proposed indicators, measures, and visuals that has been produced. The working group has been working towards getting that ready. The next step would then be picking out which of the indicators are going to be the most representative that should be tied in with the scenario planning indicators in the work of Sasaki. The big question is, should a fully functioning dashboard be built? What's the cost and by whom? We have a lot of dashboards and indicators in the region already, so what should be, I guess, the the driver behind our dashboard where the measures are going to be most impactful. And you've probably seen this graphic before. These are the major buckets that that the dashboard working group came up with, ways to organize the information, and those are the different indicators or measures that were pulled out. So there's quite a few of them on there. So it needs to be refined, it needs to be culled and streamlined to what are the most representative indicators for our region. And for Anthony Kovac, the web link has been developed for the toolkit and best practices. We're still working on what's the best user interface for making this information accessible to people. Working on the toolkit working group is going through and kind of researching all the tools and best practices that were submitted through this process that we've heard all along over the last couple of years, and building out the database for that. And so ongoing questions are what's the maintenance and responsibility. A lot of these questions are also kind of dovetail with what's the future of NEOSCC. It would be a natural for NEOSCC to be the maintainer of some of these tools, but if that doesn't happen, how are we going to get that information out there so it can be maintained and updated and be useful? So that's an example of the format for one of the tools. This is just based on the zoning map, description of how the data was pulled together, what the resources are, where you can grab this information from. And so the intent is to highlight what are the tools and the resources that are for most of them, specific to our region. We don't have examples in our region where some other best practices, tools that are out there existing in the rest of the country or the world, but the focus is on what is local so that people can be able to go out and grab that resource or call the next county over. And for policy recommendations, Kelly Britt has put together the policy brief and draft findings. That's obviously going to have to be finalized after the last stage of engagement, and the preferred vision is really honed down to make sure that the policies are very reflective of that final preferred vision. And there's going to be a lot of work with the Sasaki team on that as well. And Julie White with the pilots group, she's still continuing in a very limited basis in the pilots role, but there's a fairly large database of existing pilots and proposed pilots that was fleshed out by the working group. And the next step is, funding for these pilots. Identified in the database are different funding streams, a lot of them local, federal funding streams for these types of projects, with the idea that we can get board-approved list of pilot projects to pursue and get that endorsement from the board, and that would be hopefully helpful in going out for getting these funds, for grant applications, for asks for local philanthropy and that sort. And additional products, we have a few other things that didn't really neatly fit within one of those categories. So we have the regional AI, that is wrapping up, and the final draft will be late August, early September up on our website. We're just making some final tweaks to it with the consultant. And you heard the presentation last month from Rob Godin from Western Economic Services. And the Quality Connected Places report, there's a draft of the QCP work from that work stream, and just linking up, because all of that information was used in the scenario planning process, just documenting how that happened, because part of what we're trying to do too is show people how this whole process worked, and also how it was really tailored to our local area. And data GIS, we've obviously accumulated a lot of information, a lot of data along the way. So there's inventory of all of the data that has been captured that's ongoing. So what's the best format to put that information out there? A web portal, a GIS server. We're working through that right now. And obviously another question is maintenance of that data, because it gets updated on a regular basis, and if it's not fresh, people won't use it. And so just kind of keeping that alive, one of the things we're working through. And then the flagship sustainability indicators report was completed in July, and that's a standalone report that wasn't required of the 2010 grantees, but we went ahead and did it so that HUD has some baseline indicators to measure for the whole country. And that is it on the products. So, are there any questions? Sure.
So there's a lot of pieces to this, and so I'm trying to understand what our final product will look like in terms of the impact it can have. And I'm really mindful of all the previous regional visioning processes that this region has gone through over the past 20 or 30 years that never kind of got to kind of closing the deal on, on making change. So do you have a sense for how this will take that next step, and we'll have something that will actually make change in the coming year?
I'll address it and then actually hand off to Hunter, because that segues pretty nicely into the next part of the presentation. That's the reason that we went ahead and did the work on the products at the same time, which hasn't been the easiest to do this dual track, is so that it has a greater likelihood of being successful. That it's not just a plan that you have, all right, so this is the problem, now here's what different communities are doing within our region to address it, and peppering any of the final documentation with that kind of information and having these resources available, all sustainability related, things that are actually working in our area or should work in our area and are reflective of the regional vision. So, I mean, that is a constant concern of making sure that all this time and effort was going to actually move the process, but at that, I think probably handing off to Hunter.
Sarah.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Emily. So,
I'm
please
moving
go forward.
but I had a question. Could you talk a little bit, I guess it's in line with this question, a little bit more about the policy recommendations and what you mean by policy, or how broad, how detailed, and what geography, input from who, it just seems like that's the big question mark, and I'm curious how you
Well, what we did with the policy recommendations with Kelly and the working group is they went through and used the conditions and trends platform to kind of narrow the focus of here the issue areas, and then going from that, using the feedback from the BAU and now from the open houses, tailoring it down of what's the most important thing that people are saying that they want that leads to the preferred vision. So if people are saying they want more clean air and water, and brownfields are highlighted.
If there were preferred visions, I guess my concern or question is there were preferred visions by county, for example. Are they policy recommendations for any and all geographies depending on the policy, or are you trying to stick with a certain?
The overarching regional policies, but then also drilling down depending on what area you will have, there will be some differentiation. But the major, I guess the major overarching would be the regional. But noting that we do have a very different set of communities around here, not everything is going to work for one particular area.
I mean, that does segue into how do you implement this stuff? We have been talking with Sasaki about how to identify what I would call the within and between. In other words, there's some things, like a lot of zoning practices, that are basically local, and you make those changes within your own community. There are other things that are essentially wrapped up with county level or metro level, and there are some things that really can only successfully address in a regional collaborative model. Such watershed work tends to be broader than counties. Regional transit system that connects our major deployment centers is beyond one single county. So we're pushing Sasaki to identify with us what are some of the interventions, policies being one of them, that can be done at different levels. It's also important to recognize that one of the goals here, in terms of particularly on the tools and the best practices and the pilots, is to identify what's already being done. The list of pilots is extensive on initiatives that are already in place in the region. And one of the observations we've made is we're doing a lot of the right things. We may not be doing enough of them, and we may not be talking with each other across these regional boundaries. And what we've seen in each one of the purposes of going out to each individual communities and counties is to see what each other is doing, because that's a rich part of this. This is the time now when we bring all this together. And the goal of the next several months is to, in fact, pull together the different threads of the work we've been doing together for the last 2.5 years. With regard to asking questions about who we are and where have we been, conditions and trends, where are we headed, trend analysis, and model out and scenario planning, where could we go, the alternatives that we've been looking at, and how do we get there? And how do we get there has a lot to do with the products. My own experience doing planning is that plans sit on the shelf unless you actually implement them. And the key to a good civic vision is not only the consensus going into a plan, but the will to carry it out. And so one of the things we're looking in this pulling together is to identify those areas where we are already doing good things, and how we can build on those successes and those patterns, learning from each other, working collaboratively as we have in this body for the last 2.5 years. What we're seeing in terms of the draft preferred vision is a final report. I mean, that's a physical document. It's also online. It's what we submit to HUD in furtherance of the Category 1 grant we've got. But as Sarah said, we're also dealing with the products. There was a good deal of discussion a year ago about how we avoid just doing a plan and how we get into implementation while we're doing the plan. This is what the products are all about the best practices and pilots and the dashboard, so we're prepared as we do the plan to actually start implementing it. And in fact, I think what we've seen as we've worked with our work streams, our product groups, is that there's already a lot of implementation going on. And I think that's also what we see when we come together in Cleveland around Sustainable Cleveland, that there's a lot of good stuff happening. The outreach has been a key commitment from the beginning, and one of the things that we are discussing in detail with the Sasaki team and Cobalt and City Architecture is how do we to reinforce and build on the caucuses we have, the leadership groups, the champions that exist or could be brought together to take pieces of what is a very robust and complex vision for a very large and complex region. So let me walk you through the elements of this and where we're headed. We are working, first of all, in the question of who are defining in the work that we've done together on a historical and current context. Again, boiling down the conditions and trends and the work that we've done on other analytics, and I'm hoping things such as what matters to metros fits into this to define where we are today. Looking again at where we're going, the trend scenario, and where should we go, the alternatives in October, and then where should we go, sort of the emerging regional vision, and how will we get there, implementation in November. These are the three basic building blocks of the work that we're doing with Sasaki. It's a team effort. The PMO staff is working closely with the Sasaki team to pull these aspects together because, as you know, the PMO staff took a lead on the historical and current context and also on the implementation side. Yes?
The regional vision, what do you think that's going to look like, or what will it contain?
Well, I think what we're looking at, and in this is a framework that builds off of the scenarios. It's largely going to be driven by policy recommendations and the like, but taking from the scenario work the essential aspects to be mapped, but also to be discussed. And I think we can in the webinar, Jeff, we can go through some of the work that we've been looking at with Sasaki in terms of the actual form of this product.
So will it say things like, we found out that the current trends we're facing in our region are very destructive in all kinds of ways. And but there's a better future if we somehow incentivize development so there's more reinvestment in our cities and less low-density sprawl in the countryside. And here's how to produce that shift in the balance of real estate investment.
I think what you saw briefly in Chris's presentation is taking from the scenario plans and pulling out some of the basic principles, such as one may be investing in nodes and corridors. Investing in the core communities where you have your strongest asset and connecting them better. It may also involve not continuing to erode in your agricultural land. Basically working within the footprint of the urbanized and urbanizing area, which is shown in the scenarios in the alternatives. So what's behind doing things differently? What are some of the principles behind that? How does that then play out? Some of those policies in terms of land use are exclusively local. Others, such as connecting the dots with a truly regional transit system, is one that's going to require collaboration between 2 or 3 or 4 different transit units.
It's defining that path forward. That's something that hasn't been done in the past.
Yes.
So that's the new contribution here. That's essential.
Well, that's what we're trying to say is here's where we think we want to go. Here's what the people are saying they want to go, and here's how to get there. Here's how the variety of ways to get there. And again, it's not necessarily one size fits all. There's some decisions, and Steve, you were talking a little bit about this earlier with regard to the decision the Medina counties have made about the extension of sewer lines and how that affects urbanization, but also how that affects water quality. I mean, these are not simple questions, but that's essentially a local and county level discussion. But the discussions we were having with David Fields about how can we look at a truly regional express bus system connecting our major employment centers, that's a regional discussion across several different platforms of transit, and may start with the low-hanging fruit, with the things that actually can be done today. So we're very committed, David, to not only laying out what people are saying, what's the path, but also suggesting here's the direction to go and identifying the things that are already being done, the discussions that are already taking place, for instance, between 2 transit agencies about better connections between Akron and Cleveland. Build on that, put it in a broader context. The discussions that take place in a variety of counties about what's our 208 policies. Or we learned from Summit County, Joe, about the riparian corridors and the policies in Summit County. A lot of this doesn't have to be reinvented. A lot of this is already taking place in one county that can be transferred to another through different land banks. So it is about the vision that comes out of the discussions we've been having and the scenarios, the consequences of doing things the same and doing things differently, and the ways forward for the communities of Northeast Ohio. So that's the work in September. In October, we're pulling the work together again on the alternatives, on the emerging regional vision, and finally coming forward in November. The products, again, the team is filling in the gaps with the Sasaki folks on best practices, policies, pilots, and tools. In other words, we're taking up the local expertise that we've been developing over the last year in these product areas and teaming that with a national perspective. But we've been pushing very, very clearly the case studies, the best practices of Northeast Ohio need to be highly featured in the final document because, again, we're doing some really cool things across the region. Let's talk about it. Those are the case studies that you can point to and say, there's no excuse here. We are already doing this, but it may not be. We may be doing it in Lorain County, and we should probably be doing it in Trumbull County. Vice versa. And then assuring that there's alignment with the vision and final products. And that's, to your point, I think earlier, where do the policies fit in? Where do the policies go? You got policies over here, you got a vision. We got to do that. We're going to do that in October. How do the tools that we've identified here begin to implement your vision and what pilots fit in that? We're going to be having a set of regional vision webinars in October and also another final round of public meetings where we take the emerging regional vision again out to the public. We thought we had a very good formula last time with regard to essentially county level meetings. We did 10 last time. We're looking at something of about the same level, but that we got, I think people were very close to the topic when we went into the individual communities. The other piece of this is the development of the caucuses. We've had discussions with the transit agencies. We've had discussions with the parks. We've begun to have some discussions with the health sector. We have on the board groups that we've asked from the beginning to represent a broader constituency. We need to revisit that. But there are also groups that we've touched on that we haven't really drilled down on. And Patty's come up with a list that we're working with her and with the Suzaki team to identify emerging caucuses or groups that we need to bring these ideas back to. And we'll be working on that. Again, what's the purpose of that? These are the entities that actually do stuff. In other words, if the transit agencies are in agreement that we ought to have a long-term plan to implement a regional transit network, those agencies are the ones that are going to carry it out. We need to be supportive. If the parks boards feel that it's important and they can put into their capital planning connecting the major metro parks, then they're the ones that are the champions of that project. That's how you get it implemented. By identifying the champions and focusing the budgets and the staff of those entities, that's where getting this right in this period is important. And finally, in discussions with the technical steering committee, the determination was made that what we ought to do as a final capstone is a set of 3 MPO COG workshops working in the NEFCO area with the 4 counties and the 2 metropolitan planning organizations in the Akron-Canton area, working with NOACA and working with EastGate to bring together the elected officials on those bodies and the constituencies in those geographies. Again, here's to discuss and vet the plan, but also to really focus on what are we going to do? What are we going to do next? Now, one of the things that came out of the discussions that is beyond the contract scope and also beyond our current agreement with HUD is a potential for a vibrant NEO convening in the spring. We haven't really discussed this, but it came out of our discussions with Suzaki that would be a good thing to bring folks together across the region. It's a sketch at this point, and it depends heavily on whether or not HUD grants us the extension that we are requesting to go 6 months out from our February anniversary date to the end of July of next year. And I would note that the 4 MPOs and the COGs have all built into their work programs continued engagement until that point. So we've been discussing and we'll be submitting to Steve Cerny the documentation to request that. One of the things we'd like to discuss through the technical steering committee and the executive committee of this board as to whether some sort of a broader convening is possible and appropriate. Because we've identified and been involved with a wide range of folks across the region. One of the things we think is important is to build those and reinforce those connections across the line. We will also be between now and the end of the year putting tools, data, and project materials online, and Sarah talked about that. It's a very ambitious culmination of 3 years worth of work. We have a very good team, and your continued involvement is absolutely essential to getting this done. We are going to be coming forward with material, with drafts, and as usual, putting demands on you to focus on this work in the coming months, so that what we come out of the effort is with a product that you feel comfortable taking to your boards, to your appointing authorities, and saying this is the real thing when we come together as a board to endorse it and to move forward as a final document. We would want to make sure that it's done with the enthusiasm at the end that we had at the beginning. So that's where we are on our work, and answer any questions you have. Yes, Jim.
I would just echo David's point. I think you're getting to some extent of the detail on the policies, but my hope is that we don't simply say something like preserve farmland, that we say here are specific policies that will preserve farmland. Here's what other states have done, here's what other communities. So that if you want to preserve farmland, do this with zoning, do this with buybacks and whatnot, and leases and whatnot, so that there are specific policies.
Well, what you did not see, because it was a very small graphic, and we reviewed it with TSC, is the format that Sasaki has used in Des Moines. Here are the objectives, here are the policies, here's a matrix of what you could work on. That's one way of presenting it. But again, I think that it's going to be very important that we'll come forward with that information, but if it's not detailed enough, if you think we should push further, you need to voice your opinion on that as well.
Well, it's how much farmland do we need to have a sustainable food system in our region in the future? What's that acreage? And then what are the policies that would protect that acreage? So what's the target, and then how do we get there?
I'm not sure we're prepared to figure out the calorie requirements of 4 million people and how much of that we could grow locally, but I will say that one of the things we have identified, and Joe's been very important in this, is to working with the Sasaki folks, identify what is essentially the high-quality farmland. And it's very clear that a lot of our scattered incremental urbanization further out erodes that and erodes the integrity of that farmland. We did have a very important meeting that Steve asked us to convene it's sort of an emerging caucus on local food, where you bring together the folks that are doing urban agriculture, folks in doing the winery in Huff, for instance, with the people that are dealing with some of the challenges of getting prime farmland that's been fallow back into circulation in areas like Geauga County, Lorain County, and Medina County. But I think one of the things we need to be talking about is how we stop eroding this asset so that it's available, to your point, for growth. And our patterns of urbanization have tended to erode the quality and integrity of that as farming property.
And I guess what my vision is that if you give a principle to a policymaker, whether it's a legislator or a mayor, and say we want to, for example, push development inward toward the urban core, that their response is going to be, okay, give me an idea, a bill, what can I put into a bill, or what can I put into a policy to implement that? I think you need that level of detail to be really adding value to what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm. That's just.
Well, two thoughts. One kind of related to what Ed and David said. I think procedurally, we've been having a lot of our meetings lately have been focused on reporting out. Hearing what Sasaki did, going back to when we did the conditions and trends. I think that's all been necessary to understand the trends and what's going on. But I think kind of for the scenario moving forward, it would be helpful if these meetings were focused a little bit more on discussion of some of these policy items, because one thing I'm a little bit afraid of is we'll get, the clock's ticking, we'll get to the end of the project and we won't have done due diligence kind of discussing or debating some of these policy ideas in a way that involves everyone on the board. And I think that becomes problematic for us when we then in turn go to take back some of these ideas to our respective boards. And the other thought on what Ed brought up was, I think it's important to view the policies not just as regulatory or legislative things. I think some of them will be, but I think for some of the ideas, looking at how do we implement these things in a collaborative way, in a consensus building way, engaging the private sector, engaging citizens. And I don't think anyone's proposed not doing that, but just I think we tend to think of policy as kind of this top-down legislative strategy, and while I think a lot of them, environmental protection, for example, it's hard to do that without regulations on air or water quality. I mean, we've done that since the late 60s, but I think for some of these other community building, place-making things, exploring, putting us in a position where we can go forward and build collaborations with people, non-governmental people, moving forward is important.
Oh yeah, no, it's very important to get that civic engagement all the way through. And an awful lot of policies really could be basically community standards. This is what we do. This is how we do it. And it may get embedded in zoning or other regulation, but it starts with people wanting to maintain or protect the quality of their communities. This has all been very helpful, and I think as we frame up the coming meetings, Jeff, we need to make sure that we've been pushing a lot of stuff out because we've had to have a lot of grist in this mill, and this is a very big, ambitious idea. But to your point, if this doesn't reflect a robust discussion that you've had at this board, then we're not doing our job. So I think we're at the position now where we need to have those discussions around those specifics. Yes, Jay.
Comment and then a question. I see it as challenging to come up with a graphic representation of the regional vision. So I'm interested in how Sasaki handles that. But I wondered, as a board, are you interested, do you think you'd be interested in having us endorse these products incrementally or one big report at the end?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we're trying to make it as an integrated product. So, I mean, it should be here's the framework, and here's how here are the tools of the products to carry it out. We're frankly relying on the working groups to come forward with specific recommendations, but we haven't said we need to bring each one of the products back to this board. If the body wants to do that, I think we can discuss that, but we're really trying to feed it all into one single work product. Yes.
I think it's important that this is a plan, it's very comprehensive, but it's a cookbook. We don't have to cook every recipe the same day, and it's not going to happen that way. Things are going to stop and start.
This is the joy of cooking for the region?
That's right.
Okay. We don't have to make the entire...
The whole book is not going to be, unless, we're not. Transit can go forward on that. Housing maybe, that can go forward. But metro parks and getting those linkages maybe first.
Well, I think that raises an important point, and I think when we were discussing this for the technical steering committee, there was a very real concern that what we're doing is not a plan that looks like a land use plan being imposed on folks. This is really a framework for the future, and it's a framework that needs to frame discussions. And we talked a little when Emily was presenting about how we bring together some of the themes on economic development with some of the themes on housing, and that's not going to be solved in one moment. But it's a topic that must be addressed. So my hope is that this framework frames up an ongoing set of discussions at the appropriate levels, and that it leads to a continuous stream of action. It's not a silver bullet. It's really a choreography of the actions for the future, but it needs to build on the momentum that's already there. And I think one of the big discoveries that I think we've all made as we've gone around the region is the number of different good things that are going on, the number of champions that are going on. Patty's made the point to us about groups and individuals that want to continue to promote the work they're doing in a broader context. And that's where some of the motivation for the caucuses comes from. And I see, again, we've seen this in each of our communities which have gone out to these county meetings. And some communities are going to deal with the one set of priorities more because of the challenges in a different way than another. Jason?
Just one other thought, and this might segue into, I think, what Grace is going to report on the Futures Committee. As we're thinking about policy recommendations and moving forward, they have a very strong tie-in to the future of the organization. Yes. And I think it would be wise if we can narrow the focus somewhat onto, not that we have to cut off other topics or other options, but maybe really focusing on 2 or 3 things that we feel the consortium can make progress on or help be a catalyst on, because I think it both helps the public understand what we're up to, what we're focusing on. But I think, it's always been the challenge and the opportunity of this organization is because it is so broad, both geographically and topically. In a lot of ways that's been great, but in some ways we've always had that I think internally and externally, that communications issue of, well, what are you actually promoting? So I think the more we can narrow that focus, it would help us a lot in the future.
Well, certainly, I think we need to, as a staff, we need to hear from you about those things that we can achieve broad agreement on. There's an old lesson as sort of the cookbook analogy. You can have it all, you just can't have it all at once. So where are the early victories or the critical moves that have the highest leverage that this body feels we really need to focus on 1, 2, or 3 things to start with. See it shows success there, and other success will follow.
That probably is the perfect segue to go into the Futures Committee. The Futures Committee has been meeting, and we met 2 weeks ago with the consultant, basically to talk about 2 areas. One being the organizational activities that NEOSCC would undertake after the grant period, and secondly, what the board structure would look like, or what it would be. And there's been a lot of discussion amongst the group, and with the organizational activity, we've talked about really 3 kinds of possibilities. One is assisting, meaning that NEOSCC is an organization that provides technical assistance, tools, and data. We can be an organization that is assembling and engaging and advocating for change. And so we've sort of been kind of the first 2, and maybe this is the advocating for change part is where we go next. Nevertheless, the group is still undertaking that discussion. What was really more, I think, more time was probably spent on what the board should be, and we looked at large scale, medium scale, and small scale, compact scale. We pretty much ruled out the compact scale and kind of focusing more on large and medium scale. And we've looked at some peer organizations or best practice models, including some in New York and Chicago, even here in the state of Ohio relative to our OARC. So we're having that discussion. The group is reconvening on Friday to talk further on this, and with the objective of bringing to the full board a recommendation from the committee on September 24th. Any questions or comments? I will comment that I was a bit surprised it's moving as well and as fast as it is with such a tight time frame and with such an important task, and recognizing the diversity of participants and the many directions the organization could go into. We've been able, with the help of the consultant, to really hone in on the areas that are most critical, and I think we're making good progress. Anything else, either related to the Phase 3 or the futures? Moving on then for information. The only report, I believe, that we will be giving is the Executive Committee report, and we met 2 weeks ago, and there were 3 basic items on the agenda, or that we really talked about. One was the Phase 3, which Hunter covered pretty well here in this meeting. Also, we talked about the Fund for Our Economic Future and what their remaining funds would be used for. We are following up with a meeting with them. I believe we've got it scheduled for Thursday. So Hunter and I will meet with the fund and talk about where the remainder of the grant dollars would be best suited for our organization. And we had talked about at one time using it for the products. Open is also perhaps some funding within that context for the future of NEOSCC. So we'll have a little bit more information. We're meeting with Brad Whitehead as well as Bob Jaquay from the Gun Foundation. So So we will provide you with update as that progresses. And relative to financials, we are looking to, and Emma, tell me if we've done it officially or not, the 6-month extension? So we are looking at submitting to HUD a request for a 6-month extension. And that's really, for the most part, to close things out. And those were the primary things that we discussed at the executive committee. Hunter, did you want to elaborate on any of those?
No, I think, again, we'd had a very productive discussion with Steve Cernay Friday about the extension, and we're submitting the documents either this week or early next. So we have some of the financials.
So, Emma, did you want to give a financial report? Or are you comfortable with what's in the package?
Our update through month end July.
Okay. All right, great. Any old business?
I wanted to report on staffing if I can, and I think you may want to have this guy for this time too. On the staffing side, we're in a transition period right now. Two of our staff people, two of our project managers, Kelly Britt and Joe McDonald, have applied for and accepted posts at NEOSCC. They will be with us full-time until the end of September, and then 50% time on average between now and the end of the year to complete the work on this on the program. Also, Julie White, who was an intern, who we put on full-time to do the pilots, has accepted a fellowship at Kent State Urban Design Center. And as Sarah mentioned, will be available on a limited basis to finish that work, but she did a remarkable job of laying out the existing pilot projects that are in the region, and with her committee identifying potential. So really, we're at a point now where the next step is whether and how to implement the pilot program, and when to do that. At that point, we will restaff. Zach Brown, as an intern, has taken a job in the private sector. He's going to be a lands. He's a budding lawyer, finishing his law degree, and he took a position for those of you who are in parts of the region that have the oil and shale industry. That the title work there is one of the things that those guys do. So he's moving into his professional world. Antoine Bowie has been promoted from an intern to a full-time staff person. He's been doing a remarkable job keeping track, among other things, of everything we say at these meetings. And we're going to be looking at, as we have with the University of Akron, successfully at additional interns as needed. But that's where we are in this transitional period. And you may want to talk about another transition that's going on as well.
Yes. I was going to get to that, but I'll skip it. Or I guess I'll jump ahead. Would like to thank Bill Miller for his work with NEOSCC. Bill has decided to retire from the Trumbull County Planning Commission. I think I asked him what he planned to do, and he said fishing. So when you see the sign "Gone Fishing," that's where Bill will be. So I'd like to give a round of applause to Bill, both for his work on behalf of Trumbull County and his work with us here at NEOSCC. We wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. And I just wanted to make a comment that it's been a pleasure working with all of you. Got to know some of you pretty well, and the staff's been excellent. Of course, HUD as a agency has been stellar. My alternate, who hasn't been to meetings, she holds down the fort when I'm gone. She's the assistant director of the Planning Commission. Has been there for 17 years and is a great asset to Trumbull County and the
and the whole region. So hopefully if she gets time to take this project to completion, you'll see her smiling face here for the next few months. But anyway, thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
I want to thank Bill.
Great work.
I just want to thank you personally, Bill. Bill, along with Kirby Date, were very early on in working tirelessly to put together the original work program with me and with Sarah Meyer that we submitted to HUD, and brought forward all the years of experience with OKI about how to do one of these things and how to avoid pitfalls. I think it took 7 years to do that, as I recall, something like that. But I think much of what you see in the work program that we developed and then modified a year ago was based on the guidance that Bill was able to give us from the very beginning about how do you handle a project of this scale and complexity and live to tell the tale. So again, thank you for your help all the way along.
I have to add to that because you did a lot of work at the beginning, and we couldn't be where we are today without the foundation. So thanks, Chris.
I did want to make a comment on the staffing relative to Kelly Britt and Joe McDonald. We did hire them as a part of the NEOSCC staff, or to become part of the NEOSCC staff. And I would like to say that I think one of the objectives of NEOSCC was to provide technical capacity to the region. And I think the hiring of the staff, keeping them local, does exactly that. So I think we've achieved that end. And I think the fact that they're coming over to NEOSCC, we will be able to continue to have them phase out their work here, so there will not be any kind of gap. Did I miss the finance report?
Yeah.
Yes, I apologize. Did you want to make a finance report?
Just for brevity's sake, I just want to say that we did have a meeting, and there will be a audit report from Meaden & Moore for board action next month. It was a clean audit and no concerns. So I think we'll bring that to you in September. That's it.
And you have finally the watch list with all the specifics on it. And I would point out we have a robust set of webinars and meetings coming up on the next phase of work, but also on the policy and toolkits and best practices meetings, dashboard meetings. Again, it's laid out on this for you, and I would encourage you to participate in that and to take the opportunity on September 5th to really drill down on the open house and Imagine My Neo results. Much more than we could do today.
Old business?
Question.
Yes.
Hunter, in your conversations with Steve, does it make any sense, or is it necessary for us to vote on the request for extension? Is there any?
I don't know if it makes sense, but I think a vote would help, and I certainly, one of the things I intend to reference, and we made that point of our conversation, is the commitment by the MPOs reflected in your work programs to continue the commitment of staff at current levels through this fiscal year, which takes us to July 1. And I think that commitment will be one of the telling points. If any of the other organizations want to say the same thing, that would be great, but I think an endorsement of that wouldn't hurt. So perhaps the finance chair could propose that or something like that. Or you can.
I'll make a motion. We authorize a 6-month extension request.
I would second.
All in favor of authorizing a 6-month extension request formally? Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Anything else with old business? New business, there have been 2 requests by groups that are opposed to NEOSCC for us to participate in their workshops or forums. So we will be looking to make presentations or to speak at both of these events. and also announcing it to our board in order to ensure that you're aware of it should you wish to attend. First one is the Citizens Sovereignty versus Regionalism Forum, and that will be held at the Independence Civic Center on September 11th between 7 and 9 p.m. September 11th. I was told that was just coincidental. That was when the facility was available. So that's a Sovereignty versus Regionalism Forum, September 11th, Independence Civic Center, 7 to 9 p.m. And the second one is the Citizens Forum on NEOSC and Regionalism. That one will be held at the Tri-C East Theater on September 14th, 1 to 3 p.m. So again, that one is Citizens Forum on NEOSC and Regionalism, Tri-C East Theater, September 14th, 1 to 3 p.m.
There will be staff participating in that?
We have been asked to make a presentation, and I think in each case they're about 15-minute presentations or so. I'm sure there will be ample opportunity for rebuttal. So there's an agenda here for one of the events, if you'd like to pick one up on your way out. Distribute them? Yeah. Go ahead, distribute them. I'm sorry, say that again?
Do you want friends in the audience at those meetings, or do you want to just present and leave?
I can say that I don't think we would just present and leave. We would probably stay for the entire event so we can listen to the different viewpoints. So certainly if people are interested and want to participate in that discussion to present their support for NEOSC, it would be a good idea to attend. Yes, Lucy?
There are rumors that the Secretary Donovan will be here November the 12th. It's still in the air, so I can't put it on the schedule yet. But I know that they're he's meeting with EPA and DOT this coming week to discuss their upcoming plans. And this relates to NEOSC request in addition to Erie and Buffalo. So the November 12th, November 13th are the suggested dates at this time.
Okay. Hunter, anything else on the September watch list?
No, I think you have it all there. Again, I would encourage you to participate, particularly in the open house and the Envision My Neo webinar on the 5th, and then the Policy Toolkit and Best Practices Update webinar on the 9th. That's a way of getting additional information so we can make these meetings more substantive around discussions, as Jason pointed out.
Do I have a motion to adjourn? So we could stay and talk some more. But I think, Bill Miller, do we have a second? Second. All in favor? Aye. Motion, meeting adjourned.